For Brattleboro Community Television, I'm Steve West with WKVT here in Brattleboro. My guest today is Vermont's Attorney General, Bill Sorrell. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We've talked before. We'll have another conversation. I want to get a little broader sense from you about how Bill Sorrell got to be Bill Sorrell. Can you give us a little biography of yourself?
Sure. I was born in Burlington, the only boy, 4 sisters. Went through parochial school in Burlington, off to Notre Dame undergrad, then Cornell Law School. Came back, and after getting admitted to the bar, I was a deputy state's attorney in Chittenden County, and then Governor Snelling appointed me state's attorney. Then private practice for about 10 or 11 years, and in early '89, then Governor Kunin called me out of the blue, asked me to do a stint of public service and take the state's attorney's job again. It was vacant, and I did that for about 3.5 years, tried some very interesting cases. And by then, Howard Dean was governor. He called me up and said, would you mind coming over and being into my cabinet as what's called Secretary of Administration, and the sort of the senior cabinet position in Vermont state government. I did that for almost 5 years. Howard Dean appointed Jeff Amistow, my predecessor, Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, creating a vacancy in the role of Attorney General, and he appointed me Attorney General. I was sworn in May 1 of '97, and I've run successfully statewide 7 times for election in my own right. So I've been AG for more than 15 years, and I'm now the longest serving Attorney General in Vermont history.
Well, let me cut to the chase. What do you say to people who say, well, 15 years is a long time for an Attorney General, maybe it's time for a new guy? What do you say in response to that?
I say change for change's sake doesn't mean much to me. The question is the person who's there, are they energetic, enthusiastic? Do they come up with new ideas? Are they effective? I mean, let's face it, our congressional delegation, by and large, has been in office for longer than I. And so, you know, duration alone, I don't think should be the measure. The question is, when you've got an incumbent, you have a record to look at. It's not just promises. So you got somebody there who knows the job and who's delivered, has accomplished a lot. And if you like what the incumbent has done, then does it make sense to change just for change's sake? And voters are going to have their opportunity to make that decision, both August 28th in the primary, the Democratic primary, and then again in the November general election.
One of the first times you and I spoke, I was surprised to see just how much money the Attorney General's office actually generates for, or gleans for, the state of Vermont. I want to get you to talk about that, as well as you're also the role as the #1 law office.
Yeah, I'm Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state.
So there's a moral function, then there's a legal criminal function, etc. But there's also, like, well, you got to earn your keep, so to speak.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that dichotomy.
Well, 4 weeks to the day after I was sworn in as Attorney General, I sued the tobacco industry. And as a consequence of the settlement of that case, Vermont's already received over $300 million from that one case, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because as long as Americans continue to smoke from that one settlement, Vermont will receive at least $25 million a year, every year, forever, in perpetuity. But then, generally speaking, through the enforcement of our environmental protection laws, our civil rights laws, our consumer protection laws, and our criminal laws, I have statewide criminal jurisdiction. Well, the last 3 years, for example, I've brought in at least $40 million each and every year. So in enforcing the laws and in successfully enforcing the laws, the Attorney General is a big revenue generator for the state.
I guess I want to also ask you too. There were a number of high drama cases, high profile cases. Obviously, the Entergy VY case and so forth. You find yourself in the spotlight a lot. You find yourself as sort of a spokesperson for the state.
Yes.
Talk about that in general terms. I don't have a specific question, but I know that you also are, in some ways, put on the spot to be the mouthpiece for the state of Vermont.
You know, as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the state and representing the state in litigation in all kinds of courts and all kinds of issues, going into the legislature and suggesting legislative change to the legislature in certain areas, and being the elected official who is responsible for justice in the state. I mean, primarily responsible for that. And I think the average Vermonter doesn't want some partisan political animal in the role of Attorney General. You take an oath of office to do equal right and justice to all Vermonters to the best of my judgment and ability according to law. Well, that's a tall order.
Yeah.
And so part of my job is to have Vermonters understand what I'm doing, the kinds of decisions that I'm making for that scrutiny of what I'm doing in office, but also hopefully to have the average Vermonter feel confidence in the administration of justice in the state. And so that's why I take opportunities to be on a show like this, or speak to Rotary clubs, speak to high school and middle school classes, go to senior centers and whatever, is for letting Vermonters see government in action and see this independent elected official in a very important job express what I've been doing and subject myself to challenges or questions or even criticism as to why I've made decisions that I've made.
Vermonters are not lacking in opinions, so I'm sure you can't please all the time. But
you can't.
Let's talk about that for a second. I mean, the thing, Vermont likes to see itself as distinctive, and it is in so very many ways. One of the things that we hold to be pretty a value across the board is our attachment to environment and attachment to farming, to the physical world.
Yep.
Sometimes the Attorney General's role for our state is to push back against the feds. Talk about how we establish some sovereignty
I've sued the federal government several times as Attorney General. Just successfully was in a lawsuit against the Environmental Protection Agency for, in the view of Vermont and New York, Connecticut, and another state or two, for dropping the ball on the regulation of soot or particulate emissions.
I remember,
And we got a settlement that's, I think, advantageous to the environment. Just successfully sued the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, along with a few other states and some environmental groups, relating to the long-term storage of 60 years beyond the current licensing period of spent nuclear fuels on the sites of nuclear power plants all over this country. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the federal body that's responsible for regulating our nuclear power industry, said there's no undue environmental risk that requires any in-depth study of any environmental hazards for storing spent nuclear fuels on the site of, well, in Vermont Yankees case, for example, 80 years, the current relicensing period, plus 60 years. And the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, the Federal Appeals Court in D.C., just below the U.S. Supreme Court, in a scathing opinion, just agreed with Vermont and the other plaintiffs that the NRC had really dropped the ball and hadn't met its responsibility to protect our environment in terms of the storage of spent fuels on nuclear power sites. So I've been a very, very aggressive defender of the environment. I think in office I've sort of reflected that Vermont ethic about the importance of a clean environment. And so we defended the Vermont's adoption of the so-called California standard for emissions from automobiles. The auto industry came in with high-priced lawyers from New York and Washington, and we tried the case here in federal court in Vermont, and we prevailed, and now that's the standard for automobile and truck emissions nationwide. And there are other cases, but I think I get a lot of feedback, and I think I'm recognized nationally as a zealous defender of the environment.
Let me stay with the theme a little bit. I think Vermont, we're coming up against a lot of issues of sovereignty. For example, clearly with Entergy, depending on how we here in southeastern Vermont certainly know this issue deep and true.
Sure.
And feel different ways about it. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
And then we've also had H722 recently through the House about GMO labeling, and Monsanto shakes its wallet and suddenly, So the question, I guess, is, what is a healthy Attorney General's office? What position do they take around this? We're a sovereign state, a small state, not a rich state, but we want the right to do what we do without being intimidated into not doing it.
The Attorney General doesn't have a vote in the legislature.
Clearly.
That separate but equal branch, the legislative branch, decides what our laws are going to be, and of course the governor has a say, either by signing a bill or letting it go into law or vetoing it, in which case you see how much of a majority of the legislature still wants the law. But the Attorney General's got to be actively in the legislature, advising the legislature, not only when asked by the legislature. Under statute, the AG is to render opinions to the legislature when asked, but when we're aware that the legislature is looking at an area that is pushing the envelope, for lack of a better term, as is a state's right. I mean, under the 11th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, other than those areas that are exclusively reserved to the federal government, then the states, as so-called laboratories of democracy, are free to move forward to lead the rest of the country. But they can't violate the U.S. Constitution, the federal Constitution, the supreme law of the land in doing so. So the role of the Attorney General is to go into the legislature, advise the legislature when they're getting out there on the ice, and then how thin we think that ice is. And we advise them, listen, you're getting ahead of everywhere else. It is possible that we will be sued if you enact this statute. If you do, there are strong arguments that could be made by those attacking the statute, but we have these other arguments that we can make to defend our state sovereignty and why in the balancing we think, we can defend this. But you have to make that call, but know that there's risk. And that's what we did on the GMO case, and what the House committee that took up the issue decided to do was to put Vermont, to require the labeling, but to put Vermont behind, at least a year behind California and 2 unnamed northeastern states. And I think that was because, we got out in front of the rest of the country on campaign finance. We won at the trial level, we won at the intermediate federal appeals level, but we lost before John Roberts et al.
Not very surprised.
And we had to pay some attorney's fees. Similarly, along with Maine and New Hampshire, we got out in front of the country on access to doctors prescribing medical records. We won at the trial level here in Vermont. Ultimately, we lost at the U.S. Supreme Court, had to pay some money in attorney's fees there. So the legislature gets to make the ultimate decision, but the Attorney General should be advising the legislature, and that's what we've done. And they get to make that decision as to whether they want to run the risk that we're going to be sued and we might lose. Now, another example would be several years ago where the legislature decided to require the labeling of consumer products carrying mercury, because the mercury can be so hazardous to human health and to the environment. The industry turned around and sued us, actually won at the federal court level. The law struck down as a violation of the industry's constitutional rights. But we successfully appealed that decision, won on appeal, and now the law in Vermont does require the labeling of consumer products that contain mercury. So if the legislature had blinked because the industry was threatening suit, then in that case, we wouldn't have the law that we have today, which is better protective of consumers. And so it's a balance. The legislature gets to make the calls, but with the Attorney General advising them of the risks. And then the legislature can make that call, and our job is to enforce those laws that the legislature enacts, and when our statutes are attacked, to zealously defend the legitimacy of those statutes in court. And that's what we do.
So let's flesh that out a little bit in context of Entergy and the lawsuit, et cetera. I guess after the decision from Judge Murtha, there was a lot of discussion, do we appeal, do we not appeal? And some concerns, reasonably, in 2012, America is, we're broke. We're constantly fighting for money. Every municipality, county, and the state as proper is always counting every dime and dollar.
Sure.
So, like, do we appeal? Do we lose money? And so talk to me about, as much as I get what you're saying about advocating in that direction for our sovereignty, things cost real money.
Things cost real money.
So talk about that pragmatic side of it.
And the question is, how strongly does the legislature feel about this or that law? And the legislature feels very strongly about the law that gives our legislature a say on the relicensing of Vermont Yankee. And if we get the time, I'll come back to an existing statute about super PACs in Vermont, and one which the legislature, at least right now, doesn't seem to feel as strongly. But in the case of the law that gives our legislature a say on the relicensing of Vermont Yankee, we were in the legislature. We were telling them radiological safety concerns are exclusively the jurisdiction of the federal government. You may not make decisions, legal decisions in Vermont that are based on considerations or concerns about radiological safety. There are other concerns or considerations that are legitimately the state's, like the reliability of a nuclear power plant, whether the existence of this plant is good for the environment, good for the economy, issues about the power mix of the power that's being consumed in the state, and where does nuclear fit in there, along with hydro or wind or solar or whatever. Judge Murtha, in rendering his decision, looked to the decisions, or excuse me, the statements of a relative handful of legislators and said those legislators were speaking for all 180 members of the legislature, and so I'm going to strike down the law. With all due respect, we think Judge Murtha got it wrong on that. We don't think he followed the precedent, the controlling precedent that he should be following, that of the U.S. Supreme Court in a California case that relates to a ban or moratorium that the California General Assembly passed for any new nuclear power plants in California. And so we wanted to appeal that piece of the judge's decision. And then the other piece, which most people don't know about, it's a constitutional issue, the so-called Dormant Commerce Clause piece of his decision. That's the one that would require us, if ultimately it's not reversed, to pay some attorney's fees to Entergy.
Right.
So I obviously talked with influential members of the government in the legislative branch and in the executive branch. My mail ran 95% plus in favor of the appeal. It was my decision, and for a number of reasons, some of which we've already talked about, I thought taking that appeal was the right decision. We've gotten good feedback on the briefs that we filed and the friend of the court briefs that I arranged to have written and filed. Entergy will file in early September. We'll have a couple of months to file other arguments, and the case will be argued before the federal court, appeals court in New York City, probably early next year sometime, and we feel good about our chances.
And potentially onward to the Supreme Court from there.
Potentially onward to the Supreme Court from there. Now, you mentioned about laws that might fall if attacked in court, and so not only do we advise the legislature when it enacts statutes, but sometimes the law evolves without the legislature doing anything. As we see what courts around the country, particularly federal courts, are deciding. And so in this issue of a super PAC that was just registered in Vermont for this campaign season, they said they're only going to do so-called independent expenditures. In other words, they're not going to coordinate with any campaigns. This PAC is going to do just expenditures, either attacking this candidate or in favor of that candidate, but independent of any candidates. But they are not going to limit themselves to the $2,000 per contributor maximum for PACs generally that work in campaigns. Right. And we know from federal cases recently and from a decision by Judge Sessions in a federal case here in Vermont, a case we won involving Vermont right to life attack on our campaign finance laws, that Judge Sessions said, if it is just an independent expenditure PAC, case law is moving in the direction that you don't hold them to the contribution limit. And so they registered. I went and talked to legislative leadership from both chambers and said, here's what I'm thinking. I think Judge Sessions is right. Our reading of federal case law makes it very iffy if we enforce the $2,000 maximum that it can be upheld. I don't want to be in a losing case. I am going to make the decision as the Attorney General, the one who enforces our campaign finance laws, that any and all super PACs that are in this current campaign, as long as they do solely independent expenditures, we are not going to enforce the law that limits them to $2,000 per contributor contributions. But at the same token, I'm going to go into the legislature in January, suggest to them that they make changes in Vermont law to bring Vermont law in accordance with what we see federal law moving towards.
Right. So what I'm hearing you describe a lot in terms of your relationship with the legislature is an advisory role, and more than an advisory role,
yes,
certainly.
I have an important role in the legislature, and I can tell you one that the vast majority of legislators appreciate the work that we do in the legislature, advising them, and when we think laws should be changed, going in and affirmatively suggesting to them that they do that. For example, possession of child pornography was not against the law in Vermont. It was against federal law.
Oh.
I went in and convinced the legislature to make it simple possession a crime. Mandatory reporting by members of church groups. You know, we've had problems with the Catholic diocese here in Vermont in the past on molestation of youngsters and the church not reporting those incidents to the authorities. Well, I went in the legislature and changed that. So now members of religious organizations are like police and doctors and guidance counselors and nurses, mandatory reporters of suspected child abuse. So those are examples of going in the legislature and affirmatively bringing about changes to the laws and enhancing the health and safety of Vermonters.
So let me turn the page a little bit. I want to ask you about, and this seems to be becoming, on my show it becomes more and more of a question, it seems to be in Vermont in general, there seems to be a pretty significant change in attitude in Vermont and around the country around marijuana laws. There's push throughout the state, throughout the country for legalization, decriminalization. We have dispensary laws, we have medical marijuana laws. Talk to me about the juxtaposition of, again, a sovereign state against federal auspices that says, yeah, no way, but we're as a state saying, like, well, maybe we want to do things differently.
Well, states can try doing it differently, but there's nothing that the Vermont legislature can do that changes federal law.
Of course.
So unless and until the Congress changes federal law and decriminalizes or legalizes marijuana, it's going to remain against the law in Vermont and in all the other states.
But we see other states practicing, that sort of gray area.
Decriminalization.
Right.
And I think most of the New England states except New Hampshire and Vermont have decriminalized. And what I've been saying on that is for small amounts of marijuana, I see the merit of not saddling somebody with a criminal conviction.
Not to mention the cost of incarcerating somebody.
Sure, although we don't incarcerate very many folks for the simple possession of marijuana. I mean, those who think that all of a sudden we're going to free up all kinds of bed space and police time and everything and prosecutor time, that I think is kind of wishful thinking. But I will say that as a legislator, as a citizen, I'm in favor of decriminalization. I am the state's chief law enforcement officer, and so I'm uncomfortable espousing something when it will remain against federal law. But if the Vermont legislature chooses to decriminalize marijuana come January, there won't be a complaint from the Attorney General on
I
that.
can understand that. I want to ask you, we've had a number of high-profile cases here in Windham County and also around the state around tasers and non-lethal weapons and use of non-lethal force. You have a pretty consistent record of exonerating law enforcement officers, and correct me if I'm wrong with this.
Yeah, you're wrong on that.
Okay, so correct me. And give me a sense of this is a morphing, growing, changing concept, and the enforcement thereof seems to lag behind certain realities. I just want you to give me a couple of minutes on your thoughts on that.
First of all, no prosecutor in Vermont history has prosecuted more law enforcement officers than I, including here in Windham County. You had a sheriff who was removed from office for, as a result of investigation and prosecution by my office, like the sheriff in Washington County, police chief in Virginia sent to prison. Pending case involving a former state trooper, alleged assault here in Windham County right now. So, I haven't given a pass to cops when we think we've had the evidence that they've been guilty of criminal conduct. But even outside the criminal arena, looking at police conduct, and as it relates to tasers, then Governor Douglas asked me to take a look at Brattleboro PD use of tasers on a resident at the Brattleboro retreat, and the then Brattleboro police chief asked me to take a look at the use of tasers, repeat use of tasers on a couple of nonviolent protesters here in Brattleboro a few years ago. I looked at the use of tasers generally across the state, got police reports on hundreds of taser usages or uses, incidents in which they were used, looked in depth at the two Brattleboro cases, came down here and interviewed, and I participated personally in interviews of police and staff at the Brattleboro retreat, talked to the protesters, etc., and came out with a report that's now on our website that was critical of Brattleboro police in both of the incidents we looked at. They shouldn't have used the tasers on the nonviolent protesters, and in the case of the resident of the Brattleboro retreat, the first use of the taser, the situation, he was trashing his room and keeping everybody out of his room and punched holes in the wall and broken all kinds of things. and wouldn't let them in. First use of the taser I thought was appropriate, but then they used it repeatedly, and I thought that was excessive. But generally speaking, I said that tasers are a weapon. They are a lethal weapon. They are certainly less lethal than the traditional firearm, but they are a weapon, and they should be used, when used, only after proper training and in accordance with duly adopted policies controlling the use of the tasers in that municipality or in the part of that department. And I urged public input on the decision to provide tasers to a police department, and public input on the policies of saying when it's appropriate to use tasers, when it's inappropriate to use tasers. The reality is that we've had a death in Vermont that appears to have been a result of a tasing incident, but we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times when tasers have been used on individuals in Vermont up till now without a death. And I have no question but that injuries have been avoided, both on the part of those being taken under control or custody by the police and on the part of police officers. I mean, rolling around on the ground and hitting somebody with a nightstick, spraying pepper spray into somebody's eyes, you don't want that to happen to you. And unlike a tasing, and I've been tased, I agreed to be tased before issuing the report, and it's not pretty.
Yeah,
it was the longest 5 minutes, or 5 seconds, excuse me, of my life. But when it's over with a taser, unless some other injury, you know, in falling, you strike your head or something.
Things can happen.
But you get hit by a nightstick, obviously if you get shot with a gun, you get pepper sprayed, then hours and hours, if not much beyond that, you feel the effects of that. So responsible use of tasers is an appropriate weapon when used responsibly by law enforcement, but like any other weapon, tasers can be misused or abused by law enforcement. And the trick is proper training, good policies, and a review each and every time a taser is employed, is used, to see, was this inconsistent with our training? Was this consistent with our policies? Should we train more? Should we revise our policies? A process of making sure that this lethal, less lethal, but lethal weapon is being used appropriately.
Right.
And you know, case in Vermont, in Brattleboro, involving the church shooting.
Oh, sure.
Tragedy.
Still sensitive for a lot of people down here.
Of course it is. Yeah. But I bring it up because, and we don't know for sure, but Brattleboro police did not have tasers at that time.
Correct. That's how they got them.
Yes.
Yeah,
had they had tasers at that time and they deployed the tasers, it is possible that the tragic outcome that we experienced would not have taken place. And for that reason, I'm not supportive of this call for a statewide moratorium on the use of tasers. Again, I think it's up to a municipality by municipality or department by department basis to decide whether to employ them, to remove them from departments if they've already been issued, but the municipality no longer wants to have the police department have them, then fine, local control on that. But if we have an outright moratorium on their use in the state, I'm afraid there will be incidents when injuries, perhaps serious injuries, perhaps fatalities, could be avoided with responsible use of the tasers. But if you take that weapon away from police, then they're in a situation when they've got to use some weapon, I think you're going to have more injuries than you would otherwise have, and you might have deaths that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Well, I've got 2 or 3 dozen more questions, but about 30 seconds to wrap up with you. But I thank you for your time. I thank you for your answers, and I wish you good luck in the primary on the 28th.
August 28th, early voting's available now. It's important to participate. So it's important to vote and participate. Have a say about whom you want doing what in your elected officials.
Right. Thanks. Appreciate your time,
Bill.
Vermont's Attorney General Bill Sorrell. I'm Steve West for BCTV. Thank you so much.